Let's talk about the different types of pedigrees you might see in genetics. Remember that pedigrees are just family trees that traces the occurrence of a certain trait, and they typically look like this. Let's look at an autosomal recessive inheritance pattern. In this case, we're using letters like capital A and lowercase a. Now, autosomal recessive traits tend to skip generations. Affected individuals are going to be homozygous recessive. People who are not affected are going to have at least one capital letter or dominant allele. Sometimes the carriers will be half shaded in if you know, but sometimes you might find a pedigree where they're not half shaded in. This daughter is shaded in, which means she is a, which means the parents must be carriers in this pedigree since this person had to receive a from each parent. So we would shade these parents in halfway because they're carriers or heterozygous. Now this son could be big A, or big A, so we would label him big A ? Since we don't really know what his second allele is. In autosomal dominant inheritance patterns, we're using letters again. And this type of inheritance pattern doesn't usually skip generations. The affected have at least one dominant allele, while individuals who are not affected have two recessive alleles. And in this case, there are no carriers, since if you have one of them, you have that trait, you can't be a carrier. This individual is a again, however, they don't have the trait. The parents here are going to be heterozygous, however, they're not carriers, since if you have one allele, you have the trait. These parents had to be heterozygous since this individual is a. And again, this individual is big A ? Since we don't know that second allele. Now, sex-linked inheritance is a little bit different. In X-linked recessive traits, affected females are going to be XhH, and affected males are going to be XLHY. Unaffected females have at least one big H. Unaffected males can only have one big H since they only have one X chromosome. These types of inheritance patterns can be a little bit more difficult to understand and to work through, but I like to remind my students of two things. Remember that you get half of your genetics from mom and half of your genetics from dad, and females are XX and males are XY. For example, this female is going to pass on that XH to all the males because the males are going to inherit that X chromosome from the mother. So that means they're all going to have this trait. And since the male has a big H, all the females won't have this trait because they have at least one big H. X-linked dominant is kind of the opposite. This is where affected females are going to inherit at least one X chromosome with a capital H, and affected males will also inherit an X chromosome with a capital H. Unaffected females and unaffected males won't have an X chromosome with a capital H. Since this is dominant, as long as you inherit one of them, you have the trait. You can see the father here passing on the affected chromosome to all of his daughters, but not his sons, because his sons are going to inherit the Y chromosome, not the X. Their X chromosome is going to come from the mother. And lastly, we have Y-linked inheritance. And honestly, this might be one of the easiest ones, because males are going to be the only one that can inherit this trait. You can see the father being affected by some trait on that Y chromosome and passing it on to all of his sons. However, he doesn't pass it on to his daughter because he's going to pass the X chromosome that's not affected. So only sons in this case can inherit this from their father.